Welcome to another lesson. This time, I want to talk about where the land of the shadow of death is located, or what it means. It is also mentioned as the valley of the shadow of death and the Galilee of the Gentiles, or Galilee of the nations. That I am going to give you the answer, and I am going to prove it to you with the scriptures that the land of the shadow of death is the new continent. In general, more specifically the United States, which is where the new continent is, where the tribes went. The northern tribes of Israel, the lost tribes that I tell you went to this, the American continent, and the Bible says, and I am going to prove it to you right now, that this is the land of the shadow of death, the land where the final judgment will take place, the land where the Israelites are going to be punished. Where everywhere an Israelite, who is the most marginalized people in the world, and specifically the American continent, anywhere finds death, either by their own people or by those who control the world, who you already know, worried Edomites are being the Caucasians. And for that you have to understand the book of Ezekiel chapter 17 is a parable that speaks of the conquest, more specifically the conquest of the kingdom of Judah from the shores of Africa. The true Jews are the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. Although the land of the shadow of death is in the new continent, that's where the indigenous people live, who are the lost tribes. Ezekiel 17 speaks of a mystery, an enigma of the transatlantic slavery of the kingdom of Judah from the shores of Africa to the New World. And to understand, of course, the video is on my page. You can watch that lesson. I also have it in English, if you want to watch it in English. To understand this mystery, you have to understand the mystery of the two eagles. And to understand the mystery of the two eagles, you have to understand the second book of Ezra, chapter 11 and chapter 12, which I also have there, under Russia in the Bible. If you want to see that analysis of those chapters, but basically, the first eagle is the colonial empires. Here in Ezekiel 17, the first colonial empires, they were the ones who brought the black tribes from the coast of Africa, which are the tribes of Judah, which is the southern kingdom of Israel. After the fall of Jerusalem, many fled, which is what they call part of what they call the diaspora, because the diaspora also includes the indigenous people who came to the New World. The majority went to the coasts of Africa because historically the Israelites, both the northern tribes and the southern tribes, had a very close relationship with the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians sailed all the coasts of Africa, including the coasts of the new continent. That's why the Olmec heads are there. They were merchants. They never lived in the new continent, but they did come because they were merchants. They came, they grabbed materials and took them to the old world, including the coasts of Africa. So when Jerusalem fell, they knew, because of the close relationship they had with the Phoenicians, the Israelites knew about the coasts of Africa, and it was made a safe place for them. Apart from that, the Messiah recommended that they go there, and they hid there until the period called the Middle Ages ended and the colonial empires of the Edomites, the European empires, began. And when the first eagle of this enigma is from Ezekiel 17, they are the colonial empires, because it is not only England. For example, they're on the east coast of the United States. First, before the English, there were the Dutch. There was a city called New Amsterdam. So, the first eagle that brought the blacks to the New World, especially to the United States. It also took them to Jamaica. It took them to the south. There are places in South America where there are black slaves. From that, What is? The name of that, from that exchange that there was, transatlantic slavery. They also exist. In Central America and South America, even in Mexico, on the coast of Guerrero, on the coasts of Veracruz and Michoacan, there were also many black slaves who went to the coasts. So the first eagle of this mystery are the colonial empires. The second is the United States. Watch the video for more details and then to understand this mystery, as it says here in Ezekiel 17, it says, Son of man, propose a figure, compose a parable to the house of Israel. Because the Bible, apart from being a historical book, many things are written just like that. It is history, but the majority are enigmas and they are parables. That is how the Messiah himself spoke. That is how. The Bible is written. If it were written very clearly, it would have disappeared a long time ago. So here it is, as I told you in the other lesson of the Gentiles. It can also be used as an enigma, a parable. So, where the valley of the shadow of death is mentioned, it is here in Psalm 23, which is more or less talking about the parable in Ezekiel 17. If you check, you will see that is, I think, it is King David who is speaking here. It is a psalm of King David. I am going to read here. Psalm 23 in the reign of Valera. I am going to say his name, the true name in Hebrew, which says, Yahweh is my shepherd, I shall not want. In green pastures, he makes me lie down beside still waters. He will guide me, he will refresh my soul, he will lead me in paths of righteousness, for his name's sake. Although I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And why do I say that this is more or less what is written in Ezekiel 17? If you notice here, Ezekiel, the parable more or less goes that when they arrive at, if you understand, when they arrive in the new world, he takes care of them in that new world. You ended here right when he begins to talk about the second eagle is what he is talking about here in Psalm 23. King David is prophesying of the future when the kingdom of Judah begins to be controlled by the United States, which is the second eagle. And the Israelites, while the kingdom of Judah was in a fertile place, that is the fields of the United States, in a good field by many waters, it was planted. This is in the form of a parable. It is talking about the tribes of Judah, so that it would make branches and bear fruit and to be robust. See how it fits with Psalm 23. In places of grass, he will make me lie down beside still waters. He will lead me. This fits with what it says here, that in the United States, blacks lived in a fertile place of many waters, and there they were planted. But suddenly the punishment comes, and here begins the parable, where it says, will it prosper? Will it not pull up its roots and destroy its fruit, and it wither? All its lush leaves will wither. These are the curses that fell upon the tribe of Judah. And without great power or many people to uproot it from its roots, that is what is being talked about here. In Psalm 23, that at the beginning God placed the Israelites in a fertile place, which is the new continent, but more specifically to the tribe of Judah in the United States, and suddenly the punishment came, and this is where King David says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, which is the United States, I will fear no evil. That is a key, that the valley of the shadow of death is the United States. Yes, that is to say, the land of the shadow of death is not only because there is death everywhere, it is also because there is darkness, and there is no understanding. It is similar to the parable of Ezekiel 37, where there is drought, which also means lack of understanding, lack of the word of God for the Israelites. Apart from meaning death, it means darkness and lack of understanding, and here in Jeremiah 2 it also mentions the land of the shadow of death, and you will realize that he is talking about the new world you will see. And they did not say where is Yahweh brought us up from the land of Egypt. He is talking about a timeline, a sequence of what happened to the Israelites, but if you look, he is talking about the past, and at the same time, he is prophesying about the future, because here he is scolding the southern kingdom, who are the Jews, but at the same time he includes the northern kingdom, which are the indigenous people who had already left in the time of Jeremiah. In the time of Jeremiah, the Israelites were already in the new world, but he includes them herein. This it is like a parable, he is scolding them, the black tribes, but at the same time he is prophesying Luke, because the Israelites left Egypt, not just Judah, and he is scolding them. Why don't they say where Yahweh is? He tells the black Jews that he brought us up from the land of Egypt, that included all the tribes, not just the black Jews, that he led us through the desert, which is Arabia, Saudi Arabia, through the deserted and unpopulated land. Here he is already prophesying, because if you know a little history of the land of Sinai at the time that they went to the desert, most of that desert was unpopulated, but that land in general was not unpopulated. There were several cities. There was the city where Moses' wife was, for example, in Midian. Midian was on the northwest coast of Saudi Arabia, so this deserted and unpopulated land is already talking about the new continent, dry land, and not literally dry, but as it says in Ezekiel 37, dry of understanding and of the shadow of death, for a land through which no man passed nor dwelt man. As I tell you, in that region of Sinai to this day, the Arabs lived there. At that time people lived. So what is the region where no man passed through nor had man lived? Let's see what it says here in the 4th book of Esdras, when the northern tribes that are today the indigenous people came to the new world. Here is what the 2nd, 4th book of Esdras chapter 13 verse 40 says. These are the 10 tribes that were taken captive from their land in the time of King Hosea, which Shalmaneser king of the Assyrians took prisoner, that is mentioned here in the 2nd book of Kings chapter 17, as you saw in the lesson. Of the Gentiles in that same chapter calls them people, or Gentiles, or nations, that in Hebrew goy to the northern tribes, or the Gentiles that are mentioned, or the people. The Gentiles that are mentioned in the New Testament are Israelites too, whom Shalmaneser king of the Assyrians took prisoner, which transported them from that part of the river and took them to a foreign land. Here there is also another key when he mentions that he took them from that part of the river that he is talking about, from the Jordan, that he took them to the other side of the Jordan. Later I will show you when in Matthew 4 and Isaiah 9, when he talks about the Messiah. The Messiah brought light to the land of Galilee of the Gentiles on the other side of the Jordan, when Zebulun, both Zebulun and Naphtali are west of the Jordan. So what he is talking about is the people of Naphtali and Zebulun, or the northern tribes that the Assyrian king transferred from that part of the river. He took them to the other side of the river. Then the Messiah brought light to the lost tribes of the north that the Assyrian king took to the other side of the river, because Capernaum, if you look here in Matthew 4, here it says that the Messiah left Galilee, leaving Nazareth. He came to Capernaum, which in the time of Isaiah did not exist. Cities, that city existed in the time of the Romans and the Greeks, is west of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee, that more or less the Jordan River passes through the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Yes, as you see here on this map, the Sea of Galilee divides more or less. The Jordan River passes through the middle of the Sea of Galilee, And in ancient times the tribe of Naphtali was to the west of the Sea of Jordan, and also Zebulun was to the west of the Sea of Jordan. So in the second book of Esdras, when it talks about the Assyrian king taking them to the other side of the river, he is talking about that he took them to the other side of the Jordan. And if you read the second book of Kings, he took them to various places. He took them to the other side of the Euphrates to Nineveh. And if you read with understanding, he also took them to various areas of Babylon. For that you have to do a little more analysis. But here in Matthew 4, when it says that leaving Nazareth, he came to Capernaum. Capernaum is west of the Sea Galileo, which is a city of that time, a city of rich people on the coast of what they call a sea. It was like a large lake, the maritime city, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, and here they are also. Do you know that it is like a parable because it was Zebulun? It was further away, further towards the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Then, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, who is speaking of Isaiah 9, when he said, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, and the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. If you understand the history of the second book of Esdras, when he talks about the other side of the Jordan, if you have just seen the map, Naphtali and Zebulun are on this side, he is talking about the west. They are both west of the Jordan. When he talks about the other side of the river, he is talking about that event when the Assyrians took the northern tribes to the other side of the Jordan, because if you know the history, this area was the area of the Arameans, people of Syria. It was not of the Israelites on this side of the Jordan. Then he is talking about that when the king was there, the Messiah, came, the prophecy says in Isaiah 9 that the Messiah was going to come to this region, but he is not talking about that region because the other side of the Jordan is the land of the Arameans. He is talking about the lost tribes. That is how they went to the other side of the Jordan, as you have just seen here in the fourth book of Esdras chapter 13 in verse 40. It says, King Hos he at which Salmanasar king of the Assyrians took prisoner, who transported them from that part of the river, that is, he took them to the other side of the river, the Jordan River. He took them to a strange land. But by common agreement, you have to read the strange land. You have Toriad. As I tell you, they are areas east of the Euphrates to Nineveh, even to Persia and parts of Babylon. And he took them to a strange land. But by common agreement, they decided to leave the multitude of the people here. Literally, it is Goy, people who are not Israelites, because if you read the history among the Assyrians, among the kingdom of the Assyrians, they took the northern kingdom, but there were people from the Phoenicians, there were people from the Arameans, people from Cush who are the Ethiopians of Babylon, there were people from Elam, there were the Medes, there were many races. That is why it says to leave the multitude of the people and went to a region further on where no man had lived. That is what I wanted to teach you. That in Jeremiah 2, and where it talks about the land of the shadow of death, Jeremiah is talking of the past, and he's also talking about the future. But this land, this desolate land, dry land and shadow of death, a land through which no man passed, nor did man dwell there, that is the place where the lost tribes were, which is the new world where no man ever dwelt. Here in Jeremiah 3 in the chapter in verse 16, Jeremiah chapter 13 verse 16, it shows you that the shadow of death is darkness or lack of understanding. If you read it, they say give glory to Yahweh our God before he brings darkness before our feet stumble. Mountains of darkness wait and wait for light, and it turns into shadow, and it turns into the shadow. of death and darkness here in Isaiah 42. Isaiah is prophesying about the servants of God, also the Messiah, and he prophesies that the Messiah is going to bring light to the Gentiles, who as Isaiah is speaking of not the Gentiles, but the dispersed Israelites, specifically the northern kingdom, which are the Latinos and the indigenous people of the new continent here in Isaiah 42 in verse 6 and 7, where it says, I Yahweh have called you in righteousness, and I will hold you by the hand, and I will keep you, and I will make you a covenant to the people, a light to the nations. As I tell you, that also fits with Isaiah 9, which we are going to read right now. Here it says light to the nations. Koi, the Hebrew word is goy, but it is not literally talking about goy or Gentiles. It is talking about the Israelites, and it continues here. It says Isaiah 42 verse 7, that you may open the eyes of the blind. See, this is the shadow. This shadow of death is speaking of giving them understanding, the light so that you may bring out the prisoners from prison, and those who sit in darkness from prison houses. This is an enigma. And now here is what Isaiah 9 says, which is what it said in Matthew 4, which is speaking of the northern kingdom. If you know the story that Isaiah existed when they took the northern tribes of Israel, the indigenous people, the 10 lost tribes, they took them from Israel to Assyria, and from Assyria they escaped and came to the New World. And that is what is being mentioned here in Isaiah 9, which is the same thing that Matthew 4 says, that when affliction came to the northern kingdom the first time, because the second time is the conquest, and today in the end times it is speaking parabolically that the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, as you already saw the map, the land of Zebulun and Naphtali is on this side west of the Jordan River, but there it is not speaking literally of the land, it is speaking of the people. Why? Then in the end he will fill with glory the way of the sea on that side of the Jordan in Galilee of the Gentiles, as here Gentiles is also goy, which is a way of parabolically saying that where the Israelites went, which is in the New World, the people who walk in darkness saw a great light, that they dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, light shone upon them, as you already saw in Jeremiah 2. That place is the place where no man had ever dwelt, and as you already saw here in the second book of Esdras verse in chapter 13 in verse 41, that place was where the lost tribes went, which is the New World in the American continent. And speaking of this event, when the lost tribes left Assyria, as you continue reading here, where they never ever went to a place where no one ever lived to keep at least their laws, which they had despised in their land. And here it says how they left, and you are going to see that today the Euphrates River, especially when it reaches the Gulf to the Persian Gulf today, is very difficult to navigate because it has been drying up. They build dams in Turkey, and today it is also a prophecy that the Euphrates River will dry up at the end of time, but today it is not very navigable. But at that time it was, and there are extra biblical documents that prove it, and now we are going to read that. And they entered through the strait of the Euphrates River, for the Most High then shewed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. This the truth, nobody knows what that means, because yes, when Sennacherib flooded Babylon, I had that theory, but after reading in the archives that said he left it's called a cylinder that the Assyrians left behind. Their stories were written on a cuneiform cylinder that was found by the German Empire in the 1800s, and the English translated it in, I think, 1960. A lady who I think is still alive, that lady who translated the Sennacherib cylinder. A lady from England translated it around the time of this century, I think. She's alive recently, so as if you know the story, I'm going to do maybe. Another lesson on that, in the 1800s, they removed many things from the Bible so that the true Israelites wouldn't realize who they are. That's why Christian Bibles no longer include several books that are included in the Catholic Bible, in the Vulgate, in the Septuagint, in the Bear Bible. Many of those books no longer exist so that the Israelites wouldn't know who they are. But also in the history after the year, I think it was in the 17th century, when the Edomites began to hide certain things about the true Israelites that we are. The indigenous Black Latins then, when this lady from England translated this. These documents of Sennacherib, by that time, it was already forbidden to include things of the Israelites that this lady, I think, is from Cambridge. I don't know if this is her name. But when she translated it here and they realized, well, I read it, and I realized that Sennacherib used the Phoenicians and the people of Cyprus to build ships and boats to navigate both the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. If you read the history of what he wrote, Sennacherib, he wrote of the revolt of the Ethiopians, who are Babylonians. They were called Chaldeans, the Chaldeans. The Ethiopians made a revolt. That revolt included all the races of the empire of the Assyrian Empire, including the indigenous, that if you look all what? The Germans found that if you look at this book here, you will see they documented the captives who revolted. Look here, it says Sennacherib, and these are not Assyrians. Many people think when you see these images, these are not Assyrians, these are captive soldiers who were involved in the revolt. As you see, these are those, they have the clothes, the dress of the indigenous people of the new continent. So this many people think that the tribes as they lived in Assyria, that they must have copied, because look at these images, they must have copied from the Assyrians. No, the Assyrians did not dress like this, they dressed like this from Assyria, the northern tribes. When they went to war, dressed like this with a feathered hat. And here is another one you will see, yes. This type of clothing when you look, and this is the time in which they were there. Because they left after the death of Sennacherib. When people look at this, they think, no, these are Assyrians, because they are artifacts that were found in Assyria, but no, these are captives. So among the captives among those who made the Babylonian revolt, there were several races. And here in these documents, he mentions them, except that he does not mention the Israelites. As I tell you, for this time that this was translated, I think they are called like cylinders, because the Assyrians left some cylinders. If they were called the Annals of Sennacherib, as I tell you that the Germans found them, and that is how these documents were seen, that are in the form of the form of writing was cuneiform, and these annals have a history of the people that he had enslaved, and that they made boats to navigate both the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. As you see here, I had not seen this. The Assyrians also used boats, and their empire was more or less on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So in their time it was navigable, and that is what it says here in the annals. That is in English, but we are going to read it in Spanish so you can see what the idea of Merodach Baladan alive says, or dead, was a thorn in Sennacherib's flesh. The flight of that conspirator from Elam must have embittered the days and troubled the night dreams of the Assyrian king, and so we find him ready in 694 to strike this blow on the Lamite coast. Merodach Baladan and his people fled. He had kept the Phoenician busy building ships for some time on the upper Euphrates, and at Nineveh on the Tigris for a fleet to serve as transports for his army. The ships built on the Upper Tigris were crewed by sailors from Tyre, Sidonia, and Cyprian and floated downriver to Opus. Here, presumably because the lower Tigris was controlled by the Elamites, the ships were dragged ashore, placed on sledges or rollers, and carried overland to the Arada Canal at a point downriver, probably where the canal joined the Euphrates below. Babylon, the Assyrian troops, together with their supplies, were embarked and transported to Bab-Salemati at the mouth of the Euphrates. Sennacherib, not trusting in such an unusual means of transport, stayed on dry land at the head of the Persian Gulf. He and the fleet seemed to have had a great 5 days' battle with the wind and the waves, but after Ea, the god of the deep, was appeased by sacrifices being offered to him, and by a golden ship, a golden fish, and a golden load being thrown into the water, the voyage across the Gulf to the Elamite side was made without further incident. After a stubborn resistance, the cities on the coast were taken. Sennacherib calls it a great victory. The Chaldean and Elamitic captives were divided like sheep among his soldiers. He took revenge on Merodach Baladan. Seems the Babylonian had not lived to see the great adventure of the Assyrian. Then, as you see, in the time that the Israelites escaped from the natives of Assyria, the Euphrates River, as it says here in the second book of Esdras and chapter 13, the Euphrates River was navigable, as you have just seen in the annals of Sennacherib, as it says here in the second book of Esdras chapter 13 verse 43, and they entered into Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. For the Most High then shewed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. Now it makes sense why it says that I thought it was talking about a flood of Babylon, although that also happened, it also happened, and it could have something to do with the Israelites struggling to pass through that region of Babylon that was flooded. It could also be. But according to the annals of Sennacherib, according to the history of the annals of Sennacherib, when they arrived towards the Persian Gulf, there was a lot of wind and a lot of waves, and they were 5 days in a place without being able to move until they sacrificed to an idol, and then the sea calmed down. That kind of fits with what it says here, that in that region where the Euphrates River reaches the Persian Gulf, there was very bad weather. At that time, at least, there was violent weather, so that's why it says, for the Most High then shewed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. Now it makes more sense why it says that, and also in Luke 1 here in verse 79, which says, it is talking about the Messiah to give knowledge of salvation to his people. As I tell you, when it says Gentiles, it is talking about the Israelites. Really watch the video of the Gentiles for the forgiveness of their sins through the tender mercy of our God, with which he clothed us from on high the dawn, to give light to those who sit in darkness. Here he is speaking in the end of time, in the new continent, that is, and in the shadow of death. As I tell you, that is the new world to guide our feet on the path of peace.